Back in April, fighting broke out around Khartoum, Sudan, between the military, led by Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, led by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, in what Wikipedia is calling the 2023 Sudan conflict. Geez, if journalism is the first draft of history, what the hell is Wikipedia? Anyways, if you're reading about it anywhere else, you'll see people calling it the start of a civil war. Now, whether this conflict will end up being a full-blown civil war or just a temporary crisis is yet to be seen, but the urge to call it a civil war comes from the fact that since gaining independence in 1956, Sudan has had 2 full-blown civil wars and numerous other internal armed conflicts. So while we wait to see what becomes of the 2023 Sudanese brouhaha, let's take a look at one of these past conflicts. The First Sudanese Civil War. The roots of this conflict go back to before the colonial period. The northern Arab part of Sudan is primarily desert, and the peoples are culturally and ethnically tied to the Arab world, having converted to Sunni Islam centuries ago. The southern part of Sudan, what is today South Sudan, consisted of swamps and bogs which prevented Arab armies from expanding southward and thus halted the expansion of Islam. This part of Sudan has more in common with the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. The northern Arab parts of Sudan were controlled on and off by Egypt over the centuries, and they had made numerous attempts at invading the south, but wouldn't have any success until the 1820s. At first they hunted elephants to harvest their tusks for the ivory market, but they eventually began capturing the South Sudanese and selling them into the Arab slave trade. The oppression of the Sudanese by the Egyptians eventually sparked a Muslim uprising against them, led by Muhammad Ahmed ibn Abdallah, who claimed to be the Mahdi, a messianic figure within Islamic eschatology, declaring a holy war against both the Egyptians and the British, who had recently taken control of Egypt. The uprising in northern Sudan would motivate an Anglo-Egyptian conquest of the region, finally defeating the Mahdists in 1898. The British would only penetrate southern Sudan in the early 1900s, and they would administer it as a separate territory, but they would spend far less money on economic development and education for the region. On the one hand, this meant that the South Sudanese got to retain a far greater amount of their pre-colonial culture than most other African colonies. On the other hand, though, it meant that they were not prepared for those who hadn't got to retain it. The British were mostly concerned with pacifying the more militant groups in the south, which was achieved by the early 1930s. Only then did British governors begin to seriously consider economically developing the region, but by then the Great Depression had hit, and what spare funds that existed weren't going to be spent in southern Sudan. Due to the lack of economic development during the colonial era, the South had no major domestic industries to generate revenue. This resulted in the modern economy being dominated by the northern Arab merchants, with many Southerners going north to find employment and providing cheap labor. As World War II came and went, the drive for decolonization grew stronger. Even the conservative government of Winston Churchill would go along with it, with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Anthony Eden, promising to grant Sudan independence. However, Eden and the British government were under pressure from both Egypt, who had declared its monarch Farouk as King of Egypt and Sudan, as well as the Truman administration, who was pressuring Eden to allow annexation. The violence of the Egyptian campaign to induce the Sudanese to align their future with Egypt would, in time, produce its own reaction. Egypt and the Sudan had many reasons for living on friendly terms, and we had no wish that they would not do so. But if the Egyptians were going to bribe or bully the Sudanese into unity, they would soon, I believed, be taught a sharp lesson. The British had helped the Sudanese establish their own parliament and were holding elections to create their own government, but the Egyptians were trying to influence the outcome. There were 2 major parties in northern Sudan, the Umma Party and the National Unionist Party. The Umma Party was made up of remnants of the Mahdist movement, led by the Mahdi's son, Sayyid Abdel Rahman el-Mahdi. They were a conservative Islamist party who wanted to turn an independent Sudan into an Islamic theocracy. The National Unionist Party, or NUP, was led by Ismaili al-Azhari, and was closely associated with the Khatamiyya Sufi order. They initially were an Arab nationalist party, not only favoring independence from the British, but also a political union with Egypt, and the Egyptian government would pour money into its coffers. And they would win the most seats in the 1953 parliamentary elections, which made al-Azhari the prime minister. Al-Azhari had intended to lead Sudan toward political union with Egypt, but while visiting western Sudan after the election, he saw the Arabs there were opposed to it, which led to the prime minister changing his position as well. This would anger the Egyptians, who would cease pouring money into the coffers of the NUP and redirect it into the arms budget of various rebel groups in Sudan. Now, although the South didn't have as much political organization as the North did, that didn't mean they weren't active at all, but they were systematically kept out of the process of independence. In the Cairo Conference of 1953, which set up the rules for the elections that created its first parliament, the largest Southern political group, the Liberal Party, were explicitly excluded from it, with the National Unionist Party and the Umma Party not recognizing their existence and basically saying, you do not get a say in the future of Sudan. Northerners would say that the South was not ready for self-government. The British tried to protect the interests of the South by getting the conference to discuss safeguards for Christian rights, but these were rejected by Northerners in Egypt, along with the demands for a federal system. Of the 800 governmental positions being vacated by the British, only 6 would be given to Southerners, and the British officers leading Sudanese troops would mostly be replaced by Northerners. Al-Azhari tried to appease the dissidents by appointing numerous Southerners to administrative positions, but most of them were over sparsely populated rural areas that weren't even full status districts. He toured the South to try and rally support for independence and his government, promising to raise salaries for local officials, but he was frequently heckled by the locals and was nearly assassinated by a Southern official. At an event in Juba, a local politician, Daniel Tongan, would lead a walkout during one of his speeches. One of the few institutions of the South was the Equatoria Corps of the Sudanese Defense Forces, but rumors were beginning to spread that the government in Khartoum was planning on dissolving it. The rumors were amplified by an allegedly forged telegram that made its way through the ranks of Southern soldiers. To all my administrators in the southern provinces, I have just signed a document for self-determination. Do not listen to the selfish complaints of Southerners. Treat them according to my orders. Any administrator who fails to comply with my orders will be liable to prosecution. In 3 months' time, all of you will come round and enjoy the work you have done. Not only did the government not investigate the origins of the telegram, but they seemed to do everything in their power to make it look as though it were 100% authentic. On August 14, 1955, Khartoum ordered the evacuation of the families of Northern officers in Torit, which made Southern troops suspect something. That same day, a company of the Equatoria Corps was ordered to attend a ceremony in Khartoum, and one of the last Southern officers, M.T. Tafang, was arrested on August 16th, and he asserted that moving troops to Khartoum was part of a trap. On August 16, 1955, Parliament voted to evacuate foreign troops from Sudan, while additional troops were sent from Khartoum to Juba. And on August 18th, Southern troops in Torit refused the order to go to Khartoum and instead attacked their Northern officers and looted the armory. News of the incident spread and led to further mutinies in Juba, Yei, Yambio, and Meradi. In some of these towns, local merchants used the chaos as an excuse to attack rival Arab merchants. The mutiny didn't come out of nowhere. Back in October, the Southern politician Daniel Tongan began meeting with Marco Room. They would meet with a group of Southern NCOs who conspired to get the British in Kenya to aid them in their mutiny against the Arabs. A Southern lieutenant, Albino Tongan, would take 2 companies to link up with the King's African Rifles along the border with Uganda, but they refused to join the Equatoria Corps in their mutiny. Despite it being in the works for months, the timing of it was ultimately not planned. Prime Minister Al-Azhari would try to tamp down the mutiny by offering a fair trial for any soldier that surrendered to the government, but the mutineers largely rejected the offer and instead demanded the evacuation of Northern troops from the South. He would message the British for assistance, and the Royal Air Force would help deliver 8,000 Northern troops to the South. The British Governor-General would make the same offer to the mutineers as Al-Azhari. Taking the British promise more seriously, the mutineers began to hand themselves over to government forces. Across the South, they were told to report to particular spots to meet with soldiers and hand over their weapons. But those that did found themselves gunned down by the Northern security forces. As word of the broken promises spread, the mutineers abandoned their positions and instead went into the swamps and jungles or crossed the border into neighboring Uganda and the Belgian Congo, where they would begin to wage a guerrilla insurgency against the government. By the end of August, Northern troops managed to put down the mutineers, which was followed by a draconian crackdown on the South, and all of those who were perceived as aiding them. The Southern merchants who took up arms against their Arab neighbors and competitors were arrested and sent to prison, but many Arab merchants who didn't take up arms against their Arab neighbors were also arrested and sent to prison for not being sufficiently helpful in protecting them, and in some towns, merchants who actively helped and protected their Arab neighbors would also be sent to prison. Northern troops would abuse and torture Southern civilians, set homes on fire, and confiscate property and livestock. Paratroopers were dropped in to attack Southern policemen at Malakal, who were completely unaware of the mutiny at the time. By October of 1955, the Equatoria Corps had been liquidated, and Southern soldiers and police in the South were replaced by Northerners. This repression would force thousands of refugees to flee to neighboring countries. After the mutiny, an investigation discovered the names of Daniel Tongan and Marco Room in telegrams describing the plan. They were arrested along with several soldiers from the Equatoria Corps, which sparked protests. The government feared additional mutinies, so they arrested an additional 1,700 Southerners, which included merchants and tradesmen. Despite the mutiny and all the concerns over human rights abuses against the South Sudanese, the Sudanese parliament would vote for independence on December 19, 1955, which would be formally granted on January 1, 1956. Southern politicians and parliament became vocal and threatened to secede from the North if the government didn't adopt federalism, but the demands were ignored. When a committee to draft a new constitution was formed in 1956, only 3 of the 46 committee members were Southerners, and they were ignored again, and eventually walked out in protest. And the committee would declare, "The Sudan is a unitary parliamentary democratic republic. Islam is the official religion of the state, and Arabic is the official language of the state." Independence from the British would not end the repression of the South. Sudanese forces would intimidate Southerners into compliance through collective punishment. If they encountered some kind of resistance in or near a town, they would round up the people of that village and arrest tons of them and set their homes on fire if they were believed to have aided the guerrillas in any way. About 10,000 houses in the South were burned in 1957 alone. Southerners were discriminated against for jobs in both the public and private sector, and some jobs were explicitly reserved for Northerners. The 1958 election saw commissioners violate the laws in favor of Northern parties. Restrictions on running for office resulted in many Arab candidates running for Southern seats unopposed. But after the election, Southerners managed to win 36 seats, with 25 representing Southern parties. The Umma Party under Abdallah Khalil would win 63 seats, and the People's Democratic Party won 27, with the NUP 45. The Umma Party would form a coalition government with the PDP, with Khalil becoming prime minister. When the Umma Party took power, they tried to adopt a new constitution, transforming Sudan into an Islamic kingdom, with their spiritual leader, Abdel Rahman al-Mahdi, being made king. 1958 was a year of tumult in the Middle East. In February, Egypt and Syria entered into political union to form the United Arab Republic. That same month, Jordan and Iraq merged to form the Arab Federation, with Iraq's king, Faisal II, as its head of state, only for the federation to be dissolved after a coup in Iraq deposed and executed the king. The native insurgency in Algeria created a political crisis in France, leading to the fall of the Fourth Republic. And violence in Lebanon led to the first American intervention under President Eisenhower. Due to this, the Sudanese government would request protection from the British government, fearing a potential invasion from Egypt. The economy was collapsing, and protests erupted in Khartoum in October of 1958. General Ibrahim Aboud would, in his own mind, step up to save Sudan from collapse. On November 17, 1958, Prime Minister Khalil agreed to hand power over to Aboud. He decreed a state of emergency, setting up a military government and becoming acting prime minister, president, and commander-in-chief. General Aboud tightened central authority over the South, garrisoning extra troops and deploying forces along its borders. The government would broadcast messages about reprisals against Southern dissidents, and Northern merchants in the South would spread rumors about Southern guerrillas in order to get the government to increase military activity in the region. Aboud ordered the regional governors to suppress political speech calling for federalism or independence. He launched a military operation called Nadafa Janub, which translates as cleansing the South. It was focused on eliminating rebel camps along the borders. Not just rebel camps would be destroyed, but entire villages would be burned. Refugees from these villages would make their way to rebel camps across the border. Aboud also sought to Arabize and Islamicize the South. The judicial system in the South was handled by their chiefs' courts, but in 1960 this right was stripped from them. Their traditional African laws would be replaced by the Aboud regime's interpretation of Sharia. They gave the chiefs an ultimatum: convert or lose your positions. He also mandated all government services be administered in Arabic rather than native languages or English. Those who could not speak Arabic lost their jobs, which meant the positions administering the South were staffed by Northerners. A government official from the North was recorded saying this to some Southern officials: "We are not interested in seeing you praying and fasting. Our main aim is to see you call yourselves Muslims and then convert your people so they in turn can convert their present children who are Christians. That Christianity is a foreign religion and should have returned to Europe with the colonialists." In 1957, the Christian mission schools had been nationalized, which was not initially opposed by the Southerners, believing it would result in increased funding from the central government. But this was just the first volley in a war on Christianity. The nationalization of the mission schools was an important step in the direction which recognizes cultural unification. And we of the Department of Religious Affairs are ready to do our duty. We have begun with the opening of Islamic centers in the southern provinces, and we will not cease to work in the direction until we have realized the cultural Islamic unity we seek. That same year, Khalil's government created the Department of Religious Affairs, which was tasked with making sure that their programs were in line with Islamic doctrine, as well as creating programs and institutions in order to inculcate Islam within the South. They built Islamic schools in the region, and all children, regardless of religious background, were required to attend classes there. The secondary schools were run and taught in Arabic. Knowledge of Islam and the Arabic language became a requirement to attend Southern schools, which was on top of the fees parents had to pay. This resulted in a drastic drop-off in education levels for Southerners. Parents had to declare their religious affiliation when enrolling in schools, and those who practiced traditional religions but expressed an interest in converting to Christianity were threatened with the loss of educational opportunities for their children, as well as with physical violence toward the parents. In 1959, Aboud's regime refused to grant new permits to foreign Christian missionaries. When missionaries in the country asked for permission to relocate, they were denied. The state banned Christian institutions from teaching anything other than religion and prayer, and in the province of Equatoria, the governor banned all public meetings of more than 3 people. The origins of all the misfortunes and contrarieties in our way is the Roman Catholic Church, and the greater part of these evils come from it. They do not cease to instill their poison and create the spirit of racial division, and even tempt others to mistrust the authority and law. This evil, which is represented by the Catholic priests, should be rooted out. Missionaries were not allowed to open new churches or seminaries without government permission, and could not engage in economic activity at all. The central government banned all foreign missionaries from entering the South without special permission. By 1960, all official non-religious activity performed by missionaries and churches had ceased. The ability of missionaries to preach was so restricted that reading the Bible aloud in public could be enough to get you arrested. In November 1962, the government issued the Regulations for Missionary Societies, which placed so many regulations on the actions of missionaries that doing home repair on your own dwelling could qualify you for deportation. And in January of 1963, 150 missionaries were. The preaching of the gospel of Christ is no longer desirable by the Republic of the Sudan. The practical application of the gospel teaching is against the law. Strongly enforced restrictions have been placed on the people of the country and on Catholic and Protestant missionary society so as to affect the discontinuance of Christianity in the Republic of Sudan. In March of 1964, 215 more missionaries were expelled. Southern intellectuals said the government was using the propaganda and expulsion of the foreign missionaries to distract the world from the plight of Southerners. The London Times said that the expulsion was about removing foreign observers from witnessing the repression of the military government. But the Catholic Church would be successful in getting Catholics around the world to lobby their governments to act. But Aboud's regime would also act against domestic political rivals. In December of 1960, Aboud's government was planning to arrest a large number of Southern politicians and intellectuals, so a bunch of them fled to Uganda. In 1961, they formed the Sudan Christian Association, which worked to procure financial and material support for refugees living in neighboring countries. In February of 1962, the Sudan African Closed Districts National Union was founded in Leopoldville. William Deng, Father Saturnino, and Joseph Oduhu would visit Nigeria, Congo-Brazzaville, and the Central African Republic to gather support. The organization would change its name to the Sudan African National Union because it fell in lines with other organizations of the time. SANU was deeply involved in disseminating information about what was going on in Sudan to the exiles and delivering literature from the exiles to southern Sudan. The guerrilla movement, which began after the 1955 mutiny, would only grow after Aboud's coup. And at the beginning, they didn't have much to fight with. I mean, they were fighting with bows and arrows and spears, and only acquired firearms after looting them from dead soldiers and police. In 1960, Southern politicians such as Joseph Oduhu and Father Saturnino began organizing a guerrilla movement domestically. In December, they met up in Uganda with other politicians to organize more camps outside the country, and the refugee communities living in these countries would be their recruits. A politician in the Upper Nile, Philip Padak, recruited an exile in Ethiopia, Daniel Nyang, who would set up a guerrilla base at Tirgal in Ethiopia. Another camp would be set up in Pachala in southern Sudan for the Upper Nile resistance, and in eastern Equatoria, militants founded Agu camp in January of 1963. In Khartoum, Darius Bashir founded the Southern Front, which connected exiles with intelligence going on inside Sudan, as well as providing propaganda material for the Southerners in the Southern cause. They also worked on procuring funds as well as escorting people to various guerrilla camps and cells. SANU would open offices in Ethiopia, Kenya, the Congo, and London, and in early 1964, the political climate of Uganda made it palatable to relocate the headquarters there from Kinshasa. However, divisions began to emerge between the leaders along tribal, ethnic, and sectarian lines, as well as nomenclature and finances. The organization had no bank account, with the leaders receiving the money and deciding themselves how to spend it. They would receive money from South Sudanese exiles as well as the Catholic Church. In July of 1963, Oduhu and Saturnino visited Western Europe to solicit foreign intervention and financial assistance. They would encourage Southern officers in the Sudanese military to defect and join SANU, such as Joseph Lagu. They also reached out to Prime Minister Obote of Uganda to negotiate the release of imprisoned members of the Equatoria Corps. Southern politicians and military leaders met in Kampala, Uganda in August 1963 to draw up a comprehensive military plan. They would name their movement Anyanya, which was a merging of the words Inyanya, meaning a deadly snake venom, and Manyanya, meaning army ant. Local branches, however, would operate under different names that had more resonance with their languages and cultures. The first organized attacks by Anyanya were launched in September of 1963 in eastern Equatoria. Aboud was getting desperate to resolve the crisis and asked civilians to submit proposals. However, this didn't just invite critiques of his policy towards the South, but towards his other policies as well. These proposals were being submitted to a seminar at the University of Khartoum called The Problem of the Southern Sudan, which was raided by riot police on October 20th, 1964. This sparked nationwide protests and a general strike. Aboud responded by creating an interim government and stepping down from power. The protesters and strikers, with some retired politicians, formed the United National Front, who were brought into the provisional government after Aboud stepped down. The UNF selected a senior civil servant, Sir Al-Khatim Al-Khalifa, to be the prime minister of the interim government, who allowed the return of political parties. After the fall of Aboud's regime, the Southern Front emerged as an active political party, which focused on fundraising and providing aid for Anyanya activities. A member of the Southern Front, Clement Maboro, would secretly aid the organization while serving as Minister of the Interior for Al-Khalifa's government. A convention was held in Kampala in November 1964 in order to reorganize SANU. A battle for leadership occurred between the General Secretary, Joseph Oduhu, and Agre Jaden, with support from Joseph Lagu. Jaden would become the first elected president of SANU, with Philip Padak appointed vice president and Oduhu named Secretary for Legal and Constitutional Affairs. Jaden then sent diplomatic representatives to the USSR, US, Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, the Central African Republic, and the Congo. Prior to the convention in Kampala, William Deng was in contact with Khartoum, and after the fall of Aboud's regime, Al-Khalifa implied that negotiation was now possible. Deng was promised autonomy for the South as well as the vice presidency. Deng would return to Sudan in February 1965, and founded a rival group that would eventually be designated SANU Inside, with the original SANU being designated SANU Outside. Philip Padak would defect to Deng's group, while Father Saturnino would ally himself with Joseph Oduhu. In March of 1965, the first roundtable conference was held in Khartoum between the Umma and National Unionist Party representing Northern Sudan and representatives from SANU Inside, SANU Outside, and the Southern Front. Internal divisions within the Southern groups caused fractured demands, leading to the failure of the meeting. In June of 1965, SANU Inside rebranded as the Azania Liberation Front, and Jadin responded by rebranding his organization the Sudan African Liberation Front. Elections in Sudan were scheduled for March of 1965, but with the insurgency in the south, voices in parliament proposed postponing the election until fighting ceased so they could participate, and thus the new constitution would be seen as more legitimate. Southern politicians as well as leftist parties also supported postponing the elections, fearing that the election schedule didn't give them enough time to organize. The government decided to resign in response to this opposition. A new president was instated, and they directed that elections be held wherever it was possible. The leftist parties would boycott the election. The elections were a mess. The ballots had so many candidates that most of the winners didn't win a majority of the votes in their districts. The Umma party captured 75 of the 158 seats, while the NUP took 52, and they formed a coalition government, with the Umma leader, Muhammad Ahmad Majoub, becoming prime minister. Majoub's government had two priorities: ending the insurgency in the south, and removing the communists from all positions of power they obtained since Aboud stepped down. To achieve the first, the army began a brutal campaign against the southern rebels. To achieve the second, Parliament approved a decree banning the Communist Party and expelling its members from Parliament. On July 8, 1965, security forces in Juba went on a rampage in the neighborhoods of Malakia and Krator, burning down homes and indiscriminately shooting civilians. The killing stopped the morning of July 9th, and when they examined all the bodies, the guy who was blamed for starting the fight by stabbing a northern soldier to death was nowhere to be found. The conservative estimate of deaths is about 1,400 people, with some civilians drowning in the Nile to escape the soldiers. A Southern intellectual would write of the incident, "This cannot but stand as indisputable proof of our contention that the Northern Army, under the orders of the government, is carrying out a genocide and systematic extermination of the Negro population of the Southern Sudan." Another massacre happened on July 10, 1965 in Wau. Northern soldiers surrounded a home where a Southern wedding was taking place and began shooting into it. The soldiers then went into the home and found the men who had hid from the bullets and executed them. The only survivors were those who pretended to be dead. Similar incidents would occur in Juba, Malakal, and Torit. Clement Maboro went to investigate the Juba incident, and when he arrived, he told the residents, "All of you who are here, all of you leave the town and go to the forest. Go and save your lives." When Maboro and his delegation returned to Khartoum, they had to sneak all of the evidence and testimonies they'd recorded back into the city because their bags were being checked by the police. On July 12, 1965, the Southern Front Central Committee described the massacres as a Nazi type of extermination policy. They asked the UN and OAU to intervene, as well as reaching out to the governments of Uganda, Kenya, Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, and Algeria. The Umma NUP coalition fell apart in October of 1965 over disputes whether the prime minister or president held authority over foreign policy. Majoub remained prime minister until July 1966, when parliament censured him. This split the Umma party between the party's spiritual leader, Imam al-Hadi, and the Imam's nephew, Sadiq al-Mahdi, who rejected religious sectarianism. Sadiq became prime minister with the backing of his wing of the Umma as well as the NUP. In 1966, the Sudanese government was putting pressure on Uganda and Kenya for harboring insurgents, which forced southern leaders to leave Uganda. Elia Lupe went to the Congo, while Oduhu went to Ditto in Sudan and declared it the capital of southern Sudan. In January 1967, Father Saturnino was killed by Ugandan soldiers as part of the partisan politics of Uganda, which were affiliated with Christian denominations. The Ugandan president, Milton Obote, was affiliated with the Protestants. In 1966, the Sudanese government began setting up concentration camps in a policy they referred to as collectivization. Soldiers went into villages and forcibly relocated Southerners to these camps. The Northerners justified the policy, claiming the civilians were providing aid and comfort to the rebels. Many would die of hunger and disease. Entire tribes were forcibly relocated from the south to the north, which resulted in many more deaths. The program was very expensive, and by November of 1966, about 50,000 people had been relocated through it. Cholera and other diseases were rampant, and they spread from the camps to other villages. South Sudanese outside of Sudan reached out to international organizations for assistance in dealing with the epidemics, but Sudanese embassies tried to intervene, covering up the cholera outbreaks. The Supreme Court of Sudan overturned legislation that banned the Communist Party, but Sadiq refused to obey the decision. In response, communist officers and the army attempted a coup in December 1966, but it failed, which resulted in a crackdown against communists in the country. Parliament had not approved the concessions he had made in order to appease southern political leaders, and the Islamist wing of the Umma party opposed him for supporting religious freedom. Both the Islamists and the NUP withdrew their support from Sadiq, which caused his government to fall, which led to Mahjoub being made prime minister again. However, his coalition was frail. Sadiq's wing of the Umma had a majority of seats in parliament. Mahjoub would dissolve parliament in early 1968, but Sadiq refused to recognize the legitimacy of the action. Both men claimed to be the rightful government. One of the groups met in the parliament building, and the other met on the lawn outside. The Supreme Court backed Mahjoub's government and called for the new elections to be held in April 1968. The new election saw the DUP, a merger of the NUP and PDP, win 101 of 218 seats, with the Umma traditionalists controlling 36, and the Sadiq wing winning 30, with SANU and the Southern Front winning 25. The DUP would form a coalition with the Umma traditionalists, who gave the premiership back to Mahjoub. They planned to reorganize the government and build closer ties with the rest of the Arab world. They also began receiving support from the Soviet Union. Sadiq's party refused to participate in the drafting of the new constitution, which the government responded to by shutting down opposition newspapers and cracking down on pro-Sadiq demonstrations. By late 1968, the wings of the Umma party reconciled and agreed to support a new leader, Imam al-Hadi al-Mahdi. While all of the internal drama was going on in the north, the southern resistance were having their own internal disputes. In 1967, after SANU outside had gone bankrupt, Jadin agreed to step down from the leadership and allowed a merger of the ALF and SALF, which kept the ALF name. Oduhu was made president and Jadin was named vice president, but in August of 1967 a meeting was held in western Equatoria in order to form a government for the South, which would be called the South Sudan Provisional Government. And the guerrilla factions were merged together into the Anyanya National Armed Forces. The convention would prevent ethnic conflict by providing equal representation to all three southern provinces. Jadin became president, Camille Dole became the first Minister of Communications, Michael Tawil as Minister of Social Affairs, and George Kawani as Minister of Information. Joseph Oduhu wasn't there because he was running his own self-proclaimed government in Ditto. It was also the first time both military and political leaders were brought together. However, fighting did occur between the supporters of Oduhu and the SSPG. Gordon Mortat, the SSPG foreign minister, and Jadin would go to Uganda and Kenya to meet with the Israelis. A leader in Oduhu's ALF had been arrested by Okoat Atem, the SSPG defense minister. While Jadin was out of the country, Atem ordered the execution of the ALF leader against the president's orders. Fearing for his own life, Jadin told his cabinet that he would be visiting a relative in Kampala, but he never returned, abandoning leadership of the SSPG. Mortat went to Kampala to convince Jadin to come back, who expressed concerns over his authority being questioned by Atem and Joseph Lagu. In March of 1969, a second convention was held in Balgo-Bindi in Zaire in order to re-solidify the movement. The meeting was chaired by Vice President Dole. While Oduhu and Jadin did not attend, the SSPG would rename itself the Nile Provisional Government. They also declared all southern political parties or movements in exile to be illegal. They also drafted and adopted a constitution. They elected Gordon Mortat as the new president and Marco Room as vice president. They also established a new military, the Anyanya National Army Forces. Major General Amadeo Tafeng Lodongi was made commander-in-chief of the ANAF. However, he would betray the SSPG, forming the Anyindi Revolutionary Government, and working with Rolf Steiner, a German mercenary who promised Tafeng support from the German government if he fought the Arabs separately. He also convinced Tafeng to launch a coup against Mortat. The coup plan was leaked in a Ugandan newspaper in August of 1969, which claimed that the NPG government had already been overthrown. The attempted coup ended in failure. Competition over leadership of the Anyanya led to rivals assassinating each other in the Upper Nile. Lagu was angry at Jia Den for appointing Tafang as commander-in-chief of Anaf, and sought to undermine Tafang's authority. Tafang was illiterate and was only appointed because he held the loyalties of the Latuko people. Lagu reached out to Levi Eshkol after the Six-Day War back in 1967, congratulating him on his victory over the Arabs. He also offered to support Israel by having the Anyanya hold down the Sudanese army, so they couldn't send troops to help the Egyptians. After Eshkol's death, Golda Meir arranged Lagu's visit to Israel, where Meir promised material support until the Addis Ababa Agreement was signed in 1972. Throughout 1969, Murtaugh made contact with the Israelis through various African embassies, in which he negotiated financial and military assistance. However, the Israelis were skeptical about the civilian leadership of the NPG, and would also work with its military leaders directly, such as Joseph Lagu. Murtaugh was so distressed he announced an intent to dissolve the NPG so that Lagu could ascend to power. However, his officers asked that instead Lagu be labeled a rebel, and allow the Anaf to go after him. They hoped that by eliminating Lagu, the Israelis would have no choice but to work with the NPG. But Murtaugh refused to do this, not wanting to encourage further infighting. In July of 1970, Lagu launched a coup against Murtaugh, in which he willingly gave up power and offered his support. The NPG was abolished. At this point, Tafang pledged allegiance to Lagu's government and then retired. Murtaugh would leave Sudan for the UK in April of 1971. Lagu would decentralize the Anyanya, having regional, tribal, and ethnic groups serving in their home areas. Back in the north, on May 25, 1969, Colonel Ghaffar Nimri led a coup against the government of President Ismail al-Hazari, seizing key government buildings and radio stations in Khartoum, and arresting other generals at 4 a.m. By 7 a.m., they began playing pre-recorded speeches from Nimri outlining their plans for the government. The coup was led by a free officers movement, inspired by similar movements elsewhere in the Arab world. Nimri would pursue radical Arab nationalist policies, but also included officers in his regime that were members of or had ties to the communists and Nasserites. One of these officers was Hashem al-Atta. In March of 1971, Nimri's government began orchestrating plans to nationalize the trade unions as well as banning communist organizations. He also created the Sudan Socialist Union, which was given control of all the assets of communist organizations and parties, and arrested Communist Party leaders. On July 19, 1971, a group of Communist Army officers, led by Hashem al-Atta, orchestrated a coup against the regime of Ghaffar Nimri. They stormed the presidential palace and took Nimri and his council prisoner. They gained control of the capital, but not much else. The neighboring regimes of Anwar Sadat and Muammar Gaddafi also opposed the coup. Gaddafi would go so far as to use his air force to halt a British Airlines flight that was carrying a Sudanese colonel supporting the coup. The only Arab regime to respond positively to the coup was Ba'athist Iraq. They sent an airliner of government representatives to congratulate the Sudanese officers, but it crashed under mysterious circumstances over Saudi Arabia. To prevent a counter-coup, Atta ordered that all of the tanks in the region of Khartoum be immobilized, as well as putting other units that were believed to not be loyal to him on leave. He did this on advice from the Soviets. 3 days later, officers and units loyal to Nimri would launch their counter-coup, freeing Nimri and arresting Atta and many other communists, executing many of them, including Atta, along with the officers that Gaddafi had captured. After the counter-coup, Nimri expelled East German security advisors and denounced the USSR and the Eastern Bloc for supporting the coup. A peace deal was reached in 1972 with the Addis Ababa Agreement, with the government giving the South regional autonomy, with a particular emphasis on an exemption from Sharia law. This was made possible by Colonel Ghaffar Nimri, who took power in a coup in 1969, and unlike the leaders of the major political parties, he had no familial ties to any major school of Islamic thought, which made him less likely to push for Sharia law of his own accord. In addition to an exemption from Sharia law, the South was also given several other concessions, such as the creation of its own regional legislature and its own government with its own cabinet, the High Executive Council. The legislature had authority over its own social and tax policy, but no authority over economic policy, which would become a big factor later. The agreement also created military quotas, such as requiring there to be an equal number of Southern and Northern soldiers stationed in the South. Southern soldiers were only to be stationed in the South, in order to serve as a deterrent to Northern soldiers from abusing their authority. But not everyone was satisfied by the agreement. Many Southerners had wanted to push for full independence, not trusting Arab-controlled Khartoum to keep its promises, especially because the Southern regional government didn't have powers over economic policy. More moderate elements had wanted to replace the unitary state with a federal one, with both the North and the South receiving their own regional governments, with a federal government handling foreign policy and other national issues. They feared that giving the South regional autonomy within a unitary state would turn the national government into a de facto northern government, which would still have the authority to overrule the decisions of the South. Some of the fighters in the Anyanya and other militias didn't want to integrate into the national military or local law enforcement. Most of the officers in both the army and police were Arabs, continuing the disparity from before the First Civil War. The distrust of ex-rebels was reaffirmed when the national government failed to keep the 1-to-1 ratio of northern to southern soldiers stationed in the South. Out of protest, many rebels went into exile in neighboring countries, with some continuing their armed resistance, though to a smaller degree than before. But many of these fighters would get pulled into another civil war. As violence was calming down in Sudan, it began to surge in its neighbors. Chad had been in a civil war since 1965, and Ethiopia would descend into a civil war in 1974, when Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown in a coup d'etat by the Marxist-Leninist Derg, who aligned the Ethiopian government with the Soviet Union. The Arab world began to pressure President Namairi to intervene in Ethiopia by arming numerous rebel groups in Eritrea, Gambela, and Oromia. This became a serious problem for Ethiopia when Somalia invaded the Ogaden region, with weapons received from the Soviets in exchange for leasing a naval base. There seemed to be a genuine fear of encroaching Soviet influence, so much so that Anwar Sadat was afraid of having to send troops into Sudan. The Ethiopian government warned Sudan to stop aiding separatist rebels, or else they would respond in kind. They would arm the remnants of the Anyanya, frequently referred to as the Anyanya II, as well as the exiled former Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi. Northern politicians were even angrier at the Addis Ababa Agreement than the Southerners, especially the Islamists, believing it would only foster more separatism. The agreement did give Namairi a boost in popularity amongst Southerners, whose loyalty was crucial in overcoming back-to-back coup attempts in 1975 and 76, both supported by Gaddafi and Ethiopia.
Gaddafi's intention is to be the leader of the Arab world. And now he is calling himself the General Secretary of the Arab Unity, or the Arab nationalism. He tried this with Sudan, Egypt, and he failed. He tried this with Sudan, Egypt, and Syria, and he failed. He tried this with Tunisia, and he failed. He tried this with Algeria, he failed. He tried this even with Malta, and he failed.
But the agreement was also unpopular in Darfur, which is a unique region of Sudan. Most northern Sudanese are Arab Muslims, while most southern Sudanese are African Christians. Darfur is something of a mix. Southern and western Darfur are largely African, but are practicing Muslims, while northern Darfur are Arab Muslims. The Darfurian Muslims were ardently Islamic and were big supporters of Islamist policies. In fact, they were big parts of those coups from 1975 and 76, backing Sadiq al-Mahdi along with the Ansar militias. Prior to the Anglo-Egyptian conquest, Darfur had been an independent sultanate, and one of its princesses had been married to Muhammad Ahmed bin Abdullah, who led the Mahdist revolt against Egyptian and British rule in the 1880s and 90s. This tie to the Mahdists resulted in the African Darfurians becoming major supporters of Sadiq al-Mahdi and the Ummah Party, along with the Ansar militias. However, despite their ardent Islamist credentials, Arab Muslims saw African Muslims as spiritually insincere and embraced an Arab supremacism that would result in the Darfurians never fully fitting into Khartoum's image of Sudan. There were other divisions in the south other than rejection or acceptance of Addis Ababa. The Southerners were not a homogeneous group, but were divided, often rather sharply, along tribal and ethnic lines. The largest ethnic group were the Dinka, who made up about a third of the population of southern Sudan, and all other tribes feared an independent South Sudan would be dominated by the Dinka, and thus wanted to restrain their power, despite the Dinka never being politically unified. Ghaffar Namairi would exploit these divisions in order to prevent the South from building up the material and institutional strength needed for independence. Khartoum would intervene in every election in the autonomous region, bribing Southern politicians to elect their preferred candidates to the HEC. This was seen in 1972 with the election of Abel Alir to the presidency. His membership in the Dinka fed into pre-existing prejudices against them by other Southerners. thus making unified action against Khartoum more difficult. Alir's administration would be both incompetent and corrupt, leading to him losing re-election in 1978 to Joseph Lagu, the former leader of the Anyanya, and a member of an Equatorian ethnic group. Despite this, the Dinka were actually supportive of Lagu due to his promises of reform. Another complicating element to southern politics was the return of refugees and exiles. During the First Civil War, a large number of South Sudanese fled to neighboring countries, settling in refugee camps, with large numbers having fled to Uganda under the rule of Idi Amin, whose government had armed the Anyanya militias. But the regime that succeeded Amin's in 1979 was more hostile to the South Sudanese, resulting in a large number of refugees that had been living in Uganda returning to Sudan, and Lagu would try to retain political power by appealing to these new constituents. These political and ethnic issues were compounded by economic ones, the biggest of which were in the South, between neglect during the colonial period as well as destruction from the First Civil War. So by the time the Addis Ababa Agreement was signed, southern Sudan had a nearly insurmountable climb ahead of it. But the post-war period was bad for Sudan as a whole. The early 1970s saw a global economic slowdown combined with inflation, and for countries with weak monetary systems to begin with, the inflation was even worse, and it would eventually undo the Namairi regime. Agricultural output had declined during the Civil War, which had the twofold problem of potential destruction from war, as well as large numbers of displaced people creating a labor shortage. By the late 1970s, Khartoum had a debt crisis and had to rely on the US to negotiate a debt payment plan with the IMF, on top of it becoming dependent on America for economic aid. And both the US and IMF expected budget cuts and other economic reforms, such as privatizing nationalized industries. The budget cuts were dealt with by reducing the amount of money Khartoum spent in the South, thus further hampering its economic development. This privatization would be twofold. In the early 1970s, banks compliant with Sharia law were founded in Sudan, and by the time the corporate privatization happened in the late 70s, these banks, which were associated with the Umma and Democratic Unionist parties, were the only ones with the funds to buy the privatized state entities. Sudan and much of Africa were hit by droughts in the 1970s, which displaced many peoples, putting them into conflict with the locals everywhere they went. Arab herders in much of Sudan would compete for grazing land with South Sudanese herders and farmers along the borderland of the autonomous region. We see similar problems up in Darfur, where Arab herders living along the border of the Sahara are forced to move south as the deserts shift, bringing them into conflict with the African Darfurians. And in most of these conflicts between Arabs and Africans, Khartoum sided with the Arabs. But not just in the courts, but in the forms of arms, giving weapons to Arab bands who would conduct raids on Darfurian and Dinka villages. Both the Sudanese and Egyptian governments, along with the Islamic banks in Sudan, would try to address the water shortages through irrigation projects, which would siphon water from the Nile. They mostly impacted southern farmers as water was brought to the less arable land in the north. Khartoum proposed the building of a canal in the Jonglei area to the HEC, and because many of them were on President Namairi's payroll, they didn't oppose the project. The canal was supposed to be accompanied by road construction as well, and it was sold to Southerners as a big infrastructure project for the South. But in reality, all the project did was take the one resource the South had at its disposal, with all the other infrastructure projects either being shoddily done or never started. And this wasn't some accident. As Douglas Johnson said in his 2003 book, The Root Causes of Sudan Civil Wars, the conduct of the central government over the construction of the Jonglei Canal was a crucial test of its intentions. In the end, it demonstrated that the development of the southern Sudan was not an equal priority with the expansion of existing irrigation schemes downstream. As with oil, so with water. Khartoum proved itself to be more concerned with the extraction of the South's resources with the minimum return for the region itself. And these water projects, connected with large private farms, also displaced many families who had been subsistence farmers, and those who couldn't or wouldn't get jobs from the new corporate farms were left unemployed and ripe for recruitment by militias. And if you think water rights was a big enough deal, then just add oil rights in a period of rising energy costs on top of that. Oil had been discovered in much of the Middle East, but at first oil exploration in Sudan had turned up nothing. But in the 1960s, the Sudanese government allowed foreign companies to conduct explorations, and it would be Chevron that finally discovered energy sources such as the Suakin gas deposit in 76, the Bentua and Heglig fields in 78, and the Unity field in 1981. It was in this time period that the US began taking an interest in Sudan as well, opening its first embassy in 1973, whose first ambassador would be taken hostage and killed by Black September terrorists that same year. What made these oil discoveries such a big deal was the location of the provinces they were found in. A bunch of the provinces where oil was discovered were along the border between the South Sudan Autonomous Region and the rest of Sudan. During the Addis Ababa negotiations, there was debate over how big South Sudan actually was. How big a role should ethnicity, language, religion, and culture play into which provinces go in and which go out? They came to an agreement on which provinces should definitely be included in the autonomous region, with the questionable regions to be determined later by referendum. But the referendums never happened. Khartoum kept delaying them, and after oil was discovered, Khartoum began asserting that all of the disputed provinces would be excluded from the autonomous region. Due to the lack of economic development in the south, control of the oil provinces, and therefore authority over the taxation of the sites and concession granting, was desperately wanted. The south and Khartoum got into disputes over the construction of refineries and pipelines, and this would play into the internal politics of the south. Namairi would try to weaken other opposition groups by creating more autonomous regions across Sudan, granting them some powers over local affairs, but ultimately weakening them at the national level. He would also weaken them by calling for new elections at inconvenient times, such as in 1980 when he decided to support Abel Alir against incumbent Joseph Lagu. And Alir would reinforce his position through tribal nepotism by placing fellow Dinka in appointable positions across the autonomous region. But Lagu was not yet completely out of politics. After losing power, he began to encourage the breakup of the autonomous region into smaller regions, playing into the fear of the Dinka amongst Equatorians. He and his surrogates argued that it would improve administration and economic development, but Alir and other opponents argued that it would politically weaken the South, thus giving Khartoum more power over them. Namairi, only a year after calling an election to oust Lagu from power, would support his candidacy by calling another election in 1981. But it backfired, with Alir's coalition winning 2/3 of the Southern Assembly. In desperation, Namairi called another election which managed to weaken Alir's majority, who would elect Joseph James Tombura to the presidency, who supported a devolution of powers from the autonomous region to localities, while maintaining the region as a polity. Now, if you watch other videos about the Second Sudanese Civil War or read articles in some books, a big emphasis will be placed on the importance of oil in this conflict, and it falls in line with the general materialist interpretation that is very popular within academia and online these days. But the more I study this conflict, as well as other conflicts in post-colonial Africa, the more I find that it's actually more cultural and political issues are the real causes of the problems rather than economics. I mean, sure, water rights, oil rights, mineral rights were all at stake in the conflict. But that doesn't mean they were the cause. It's similar to the American Civil War. States' rights, economic systems, and taxes were at stake, but the actual cause of the war was slavery. War didn't break out when these other things were put in jeopardy. Well, the same thing is true about the Second Sudanese Civil War. When Khartoum decided to deprive southern Sudan of access to oil and siphoned its water, the South didn't rise up. The ultimate cause of the Second Civil War was a violation of the South's legal and cultural autonomy. Remember earlier when I said that Namairi was able to pursue the Addis Ababa Agreement because he didn't feel compelled to push for an Islamist theocracy? Well, that freedom didn't last long. In the mid-70s, Libya backed 2 coup attempts that received support from the Islamist forces of the Ansar militias and the National Islamic Front, along with support from Darfurian soldiers and the army. This made Namairi realize that he couldn't write off the Islamists, so starting in 1977, he began an appeasement campaign, starting with pardoning Sadiq al-Mahdi and his brother-in-law, Hassan Turabi, who would be allowed to return from exile and be released from prison respectively. He would appoint al-Turabi as Attorney General, who began drafting a new legal code based on his vision of Sharia law, which included dismemberment, stoning, and crucifixion as viable punishments. And Turabi would place members of the NIF in offices across the government to secure his own position. Namairi also made promises to renegotiate the Addis Ababa Agreement in order to weaken the autonomy of non-Arabs and non-Muslims. This increasing friendliness towards Islamism would result in Khartoum building close ties with Iran after the 1979 revolution ousted the Shah. What's weird is that this was done simultaneously while recruiting Sudanese to fight for Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War in the name of Arab unity. But Namairi would also undermine calls for Arab unity by its covert relations with the Israelis. When Egypt signed the Camp David Accord with Israel in 1979, Sudan was the only other Arab country to endorse the decision, despite it maintaining the 3 no's of the 1967 Khartoum Resolution. And after Sadat was assassinated in 1981, Namairi was one of only 2 Arab leaders to attend his funeral. Attending the funeral alongside Namairi was the Israeli Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, who would secretly meet with him. A pair of businessmen from Israel and Saudi Arabia were devising a plot to overthrow the Ayatollah in a rebellion led by the ousted Shah's son, Riza Pahlavi, with fighters trained in Sudan armed with Israeli weapons. The plot would ultimately go nowhere due to Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982, diverting all weapons allocations to its own war effort. What ultimately brought them into secret collaboration was a mutual disdain for Gaddafi, as well as Khartoum wanting to avoid the Israelis intervening in another one of their civil wars. But with or without the Israeli help, the Southerners would foment their own rebellion. Enter John Garang, a Dinka officer who spent much of his childhood living in exile in Kenya during the First Civil War. He would go to university in the US, receiving a bachelor's degree in economics, and returned to Sudan in 1969 to join the Anyanya, where he became the right hand of Joseph Lagu and participated in the Addis Ababa negotiations. When the Anyanya were being integrated into the army, Garang was given the rank of colonel and then allowed to continue his education in the U.S. at Fort Benning, Georgia, and Iowa State. Upon his return to Sudan in 1981, he began orchestrating a revolt, making contact with army officers across southern Sudan. In January of 1983, President Namairi began issuing orders for southern Sudanese soldiers to be redeployed to the northern Sudan, which was a violation of Addis Ababa, and the southern officers within Garang's conspiracy refused to comply. At this time, Namairi was planning on issuing a decree abolishing the South Sudan Autonomous Region and replacing it with 3 smaller autonomous regions, but wanted to avoid another civil war. So he thought that if he could pull southern soldiers out of the south before he announced the dissolution of the autonomous region, then he could prevent them from escaping into the jungles and waging a guerrilla war against his government. What ended up happening instead was he prematurely triggered Garang's planned rebellion. In May, soldiers from Khartoum were sent south to enforce order upon the disobedient officers, but fighting would break out, resulting in Garang and some of his other officers fleeing to Ethiopia, where 3,000 soldiers would join him. This would set off a cascade of other soldiers and officers deserting their posts, either fleeing the country or moving into the jungles to wage a guerrilla war. On July 31st, Garang announced the creation of the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement and Army, and published the Southern Manifesto, which was filled with pages of Marxist jargon portraying the government in Khartoum as part of the imperialist elites working for foreign interests. This, combined with the fact that they were receiving safe harbor from Soviet-friendly Ethiopia, led to the West seeing them as little more than a communist front group. In reality, although sympathetic to Marxist arguments, what Garang was really trying to do was portray specifically Southern issues as national issues, which is why his movement was called the Sudan People's Liberation Movement rather than the South Sudan Liberation Movement. He was trying to bring anti-Khartoum dissidents in the north into his coalition. Now, some might be inclined to blame this view of Sudan and Northeast Africa as a major front of the Cold War on Reagan, but this perception was actually carried over from the Carter administration, who described Sudan as a moderate country in the region, and Carter's Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, would say of the region, "Examination of this problem indicated it was in our interest to prevent the Soviets from increasing their political influence in the Horn of Africa. Our strategy would be to retain a presence and as much influence as we could." The main difference between Carter and Reagan's approaches in the region was that Carter believed the Ethiopians would eventually overthrow the pro-Soviet factions on their own. And even if this weren't the case, Reagan would need little convincing to support Namairi and Khartoum. Not only did the Reagan administration see this conflict through the lens of the Cold War, but Namairi was able to exploit his and Reagan's mutual antipathy for Gaddafi. Reagan would meet with Sadat prior to his assassination, who complained about Libya's ongoing military intervention in Chad, which was bleeding into Western Sudan, and later met with Namairi about maintaining Sudan's support for Camp David and Egypt after Sadat's assassination. To learn more about all that, check out these videos in the upper right. And after the initial mutiny, Namairi began to warn the Reagan administration about an alleged coup plot from Gaddafi, requiring additional arms to repulse. The Reagan administration would respond by sending additional AWACS to both Egypt and Sudan, which became a minor scandal, with Congress asking the president to waive executive privilege in order to examine the documents around it. Now, did this plot exist? I have multiple sources attesting to its existence, but they're all from Reagan administration officials, which means what I likely have are multiple accounts attesting to the existence of the same intelligence report. So as far as I see it, there are 3 possibilities. Possibility 1. Namairi is making up the alleged coup plot to get the Reagan administration to sell them more weapons. At this time, Namairi is dealing with rebels in the south, cross-border raids coming from Gaddafi-backed militias in Chad, as well as regular threats from both Ethiopia and Libya. So it's very possible that Namairi needs more weapons to deal with these very real threats, and he's simply exploiting Reagan's hatred of Gaddafi to get what he wants. Possibility 2. There isn't an impending coup plot, but Namairi thinks there is. Something we often see from dictators, especially those who have been in power for a long time, is paranoia, believing there are plots around every corner. And Namairi is no different, which is why he had been cozying up with the Islamists to begin with. Paranoia combined with purges is not the best recipe for stability. So he may have genuinely believed that Gaddafi was plotting a coup, and thus sought additional arms to deal with it. And then there's possibility 3. There was some kind of plot. Fact of the matter is, Gaddafi's Libya had its fingers in a lot of countries' affairs in the 70s and 80s. They were actively interfering in Chad's ongoing civil war at this time, and had, in fact, backed several coup attempts in Sudan in the past. So the idea that Gaddafi was planning something, although not verified, is entirely believable. So yeah, thanks to the Reagan administration's hatred of Gaddafi and their penchant for looking at every conflict through the lens of the Cold War, they were willing to provide Namairi with the arms he wanted. But the rebels had other problems, namely unifying themselves against Khartoum. As a member of the Dinka, Garang made the SPLM look like a Dinka organization, and the pro-Khartoum Southerners would refer to its militia as a Dinka army, and refer to attacks on Southern soldiers as a war on the Dinka. Prior to the publication of the SPLM's manifesto, President Namairi issued Republican Order No. 1, which formally abolished the Southern Autonomous Region and replaced it with 3 smaller regional governments. This order also abolished southern units of the army, and abolished the popular election of provincial governors, making them a position appointed by the president. As attacks and persecutions of Southerners grew, many local tribes and ethnic groups would form their own militias rather than join the SPLA, which resulted in a lot of infighting amongst Southerners. Tribes and ethnic groups that were economic rivals over grazing lands or competitors over a particular industry would launch raids on each other, and Khartoum would covertly aid some of these militias in order to further divide the South or solidify a pro-Khartoum militia's control. Garang also faced internal challenges to his authority, with veteran Anyanya fighters believing they should be in charge of the revolt. When Garang felt one of his commanders was getting too popular, he would reassign them to another theater where they would see no action, or face certain defeat. Garang and the SPLM managed to be far better organized than the Anyanya had ever been, but this relied on brutal tactics to keep his subordinates in line. The political price of the policy was that the leadership relied on force rather than persuasion to maintain cohesion. Dissenters were removed while the causes of dissent were not, and the civil base of the movement was neglected in favor of the military organization. Despite this, the final promise keeping Southerners on the side of Khartoum was broken in September 1983, with the September Laws. These laws subjected the entirety of Sudan, including the Christian South, to Sharia law. Alcohol consumption was punishable by flogging, and theft by amputation. Ghaffar Namairi went so far as to proclaim himself the Imam of Sudan. With this, the last provision of the Addis Ababa Agreement was rescinded, and the Second Sudanese Civil War was fully underway. Southern Army officer John Garang fled to Ethiopia with his conspirators and several thousand troops, where they began arming and training new fighters in the Sudan People's Liberation Army. But due to the SPLA's popular perception as a Dinka militia, many other southern ethnic groups refused to join up, and chose to fight against Khartoum with their own locally organized militias. If you want the full context on that, then watch these 2 previous videos. Similar to the early years of the First Civil War, the first few years mostly saw infighting amongst the competing sides. Despite funding southern rebels, the Ethiopian government would pit the factions against each other in order to ensure they were all dependent on Ethiopia. The Ethiopian army would arm various Anyanya II groups to attack the SPLA in their camps along the Sudan-Ethiopia border throughout 1984. Of course, the Anyanya II were also fractious, and infighting led to the deaths of several leaders, allowing William Abdallah Kual to merge several factions and continue their fight against Garang. He cut off several routes for supplying new recruits to train at SPLA camps in Ethiopia, along with the supply lines to its forces in Bahr al-Ghazal. Ghaffar Namairi would exploit southern divisions by arming some of the militias against those who were rebelling against Khartoum. He would use their allegiance for propaganda purposes in order to portray the Sudan People's Liberation Movement as only caring about southern interests rather than the welfare of Sudan as a whole. The Sudanese army would clash with SPLA guerrillas along the border with Ethiopia. Some of the tribal militias that initially sided against Garang would realign themselves with the SPLA in order to gain access to weapons and other supplies. The SPLA would encourage members of these groups to receive training at their camps in Ethiopia, which also came with a dose of indoctrination. These efforts led to the SPLA capturing Boma in late 1985, which would become its in-country headquarters, continuing to recruit from the Upper Nile and Bahr al-Ghazal regions. However, the Equatorians remained distrustful of the SPLA, still perceiving them as a Dinka army. As often happens in most African countries, a civil war makes what is often a very poor situation even worse. Tons of Sudanese refugees fled to Ethiopia to escape violence, while tons of Ethiopian refugees fled to Sudan to escape famine. In March of 1985, Vice President George Bush and his wife visited a refugee camp in Sudan on a humanitarian trip delivering aid. Barbara Bush recalled the sad state of affairs in her memoir. On this trip, we visited large refugee camps in Sudan, where they were trying to save the lives of drought victims and refugees from Ethiopia. The newcomers to the camp were so thin and malnourished that it was like looking at x-rays instead of bodies. The civil war in Sudan reveals a growing rift within the Reagan administration. On the one hand, you have the Cold War anti-communist hawks, who see the Southern rebels as puppets of Moscow and Gaddafi, while on the other side you have a growing constituency within the Reagan coalition, that being Southern evangelicals, who see this fight as Southern Christians fighting for freedom against an Islamic dictatorship. But it became difficult for evangelicals to get their way in the administration when Southern rebels had a habit of kidnapping American missionaries in the region, contributing to the growing hostage crisis of the 1980s. I wish to hell we had forces in the area who could move in. We don't, of course, but I'm fed up with this kind of thing. Relations between the US and Sudan would start growing cold in the spring of 1985, when riots broke out in Khartoum. While fighting engrossed the South, the economy of the North was in dire straits, eventually boiling over into protests in the capital, led by a coalition of professors and activists called the National Alliance for National Salvation. To prevent a breakdown in order, the Sudanese army would launch a coup, removing Namairi from power. In his diary, President Reagan says he believes that Gaddafi was behind the riots, just as he had been supporting the SPLA. And it's not unbelievable considering the interim regime would pivot Sudan's foreign policy in support of both Libya and Iran, which forced the Reagan administration to cut all but bare minimum ties. After the coup, Gaddafi would cut his support for anti-Khartoum rebels. The military replaced Namairi to bring an end to the civil war and reverse the worsening economic crisis. This was partly why they pivoted toward Gaddafi, hoping it would end Libya's support for anti-Khartoum rebels. But the SPLA was hesitant in reopening relations with the regime. Despite supporting the ousting of Namairi, the rest of the government was still filled with his appointees, and they couldn't appease the South by adopting a new secular constitution when the Arabs and Muslims of northern Sudan overwhelmingly supported a state based on Sharia law. Khartoum would offer a ceasefire with the SPLA, but they refused to accept it, or to participate in elections until a constitutional convention could be held, with all parties in attendance. The Ethiopian government hosted a summit at the Koka Dam in March of 1986, in which all of the parties except for the Democratic Union Party and the National Islamic Front participated. The meeting issued a declaration which called for a constitutional convention to discuss a new government as well as numerous cultural and economic issues. It also temporarily suspended religious laws and restored the 1956 Constitution until a new one could be ratified. New parliamentary elections were held in April, which were the first open elections since 1968. And despite their refusal to participate in the Koka Dam Conference, the DUP would come in first, winning 100 of Parliament's 260 seats, which led them to forming a coalition government with the Umma Party and the National Islamic Front. Despite being the junior partner, the Umma Party's leader, Sadiq al-Mahdi, would become prime minister. The vote in the South was heavily split, in part due to regions controlled by the SPLA not participating in the election. On top of this, outside parties such as the Umma, DUP, and NIF also poured money to get spoiler candidates elected. After the election, Khartoum would begin talks with Garang and Addis Ababa, where the rebel leaders made it clear he wouldn't accept a ceasefire until the Koka Dam Declaration was fully implemented. Sadiq also refused to give a straight answer on whether he would repeal the September laws. Sadiq al-Mahdi was an ardent Islamist and Arabist, wanting closer ties with both Saudi Arabia and Iran. For years he criticized the Namairi regime for being insufficiently Islamic, which was part of why he spent so many years in exile. In addition to this, the DUP was anti-federalism, thus opposing regional autonomy, while the NIF, led by Sadiq's cousin Hassan al-Turabi, supported a version of Sharia law that permits the death penalty for apostates, and forces Sharia law on non-Muslims. Since neither the DUP nor NIF had participated in the Kokadam Conference, neither felt beholden to its declaration. Between this and the general popularity of the September laws in the North, Prime Minister al-Mahdi had little incentive to give into the demands of Southerners. Sadiq's strategy for winning the war was to foment further disunity in the South, thus giving him the ability to Arabize and Islamicize the region by force. Just as Namairi did, he armed anti-Dinka militias along with arming nomadic Arab tribes in the border region to raid southern lands to burn, maim, and pillage. Entire villages would be displaced, and thousands of South Sudanese would be captured and sold into slavery. And those that did manage to make it to refugee camps would be bombarded with Islamist indoctrination with a constant loop of Quranic readings over loudspeakers. This obstinance led to Southern politicians managing to put aside their differences just long enough to reach out to Garang and outside powers for help. In addition to arming tribal militia, Sadiq would also arm the Murahalin militia, made up of numerous Sudanese Arab tribes, as well as the Fur, which dominated the border region between Sudan and Chad, and had ties to Gaddafi's Islamic Legion. They would join the various nomadic tribes in raiding the south and selling those they kidnapped into slavery. Sadiq would use these militias as an alternative power base to the army, which had a history of overthrowing Sudanese leaders. So he diverted government resources to the militias, but this resulted in battlefield failures due to insufficiently supplied army units, as well as increased atrocities against civilians by the militias. The Dinka were the primary targets of these raids. As the rates of famine soared, the impact of these raids became more devastating. Thousands of young Dinka boys were abandoned by their families in order to reduce the number of mouths to feed. The reason boys were abandoned rather than girls is because daughters still had value in marriage deals. The Dinka still practiced a dowry custom where a family would functionally buy their son a wife by giving another family livestock in exchange for one of their daughters. This meant that every son a family had would not only cost them food to feed them, but they were also a burden on the family's wealth. So they abandoned their sons and left them vulnerable to kidnapping and enslavement by Arab raiders. These boys also became targets of the SPLA, who were always in need of new recruits. The United Nations would try to save the boys from becoming child soldiers by setting up refugee camps in Ethiopia along the border with Sudan. But Sadiq's government forbade the delivery of international relief to these camps through Sudanese territory, claiming they were being intercepted by the SPLA. The Reagan administration was torn between respecting the wishes of its nominal ally and relieving a humanitarian disaster that was important to one of his political constituencies, and eventually decided to deliver food to the camp through bordering countries in what became known as Operation Lifeline. In Sadiq's defense, Garang and the SPLA had functionally turned these UN refugee camps into training and recruitment centers in what has become a long tradition of local dissident militant groups co-opting local UN operations. The SPLA also had a penchant for violence against civilians, especially against villages they believed were aiding the militias fighting against them. This was part of an overall effort by the SPLA to push back against Khartoum. The mistreatment of Southerners in refugee camps resulted in more rallying behind the SPLA rather than the eradication of their ethnic or religious identities. They also began a counterattack on the Murahalin, seeing a string of victories in 1987, which managed to push them back, forcing them to conduct their raids on villages in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, which were outside the reach of the SPLA. When the Murahalin came to the Sudanese army for help, they refused, not wanting to help the militia seeking to displace them. In spite of this, in 1989, Sadiq would reorganize the Murahalin as the Popular Defense Forces, placing them more under his direct control, which most of his senior officers opposed, except for Brigadier General Omar al-Bashir. As the tide began to turn in their favor, the SPLA began to change tactics, in particular being less harsh on southern populations whom they were trying to win over, and surprise, it worked. As they began treating other Southerners better and defended them against the Popular Defense Forces and the Sudanese army, Southerners began to see them less as a Dinka army and more as a Southern army. They also began to make headway in areas outside the South due to the brutal treatment of black Sudanese by Arab militias. The SPLA mended ties with the Anyanya II in 1988, and in 1989 captured a bunch of territory, and by June they had captured all the capitals of the southern regions. With all these setbacks mounting, the army threatened to overthrow Sadiq if he didn't make peace with the SPLA. Steps had been taken to achieve this the previous year, when the DUP began secret meetings with Garang and Addis Ababa, which resulted in a second Kokadam Declaration. The SPLM agreed to drop their demands for a dissolution of the government so long as Sharia law was suspended until a new constitution could be written. But when the DUP leader presented the agreement to Sadiq, he refused it, which caused the DUP to withdraw their support from the government, forcing them to coalition with the NIF. When the army threatened to overthrow him, Sadiq agreed to enter negotiations with the South, which resulted in the NIF leaving the coalition and the DUP returning. But on June 30th, 1989, when Sadiq was on the tarmac about to fly to Addis Ababa to meet with Dr. John Garang, he, along with hundreds of other politicians and army officers, were arrested. A clique of Muslim officers backed by the National Islamic Front orchestrated a coup and placed the leader of the Popular Defense Forces, Omar al-Bashir, in charge. Bashir was a career officer from the Ja'alin tribe north of Khartoum, who joined the army in 1960 and had fought alongside Egyptian forces in the Yom Kippur War. Bashir reinstituted military rule and broke off all negotiations with the SPLM. While al-Bashir was the true power behind the scenes, they would make the head of the National Islamic Front, Hassan al-Turabi, the face of the regime, and under their rule Sudan would become increasingly Islamist. They would pass laws outlawing apostasy along with the Draconian Public Order Act of 1991, which prohibited mixed social gatherings between men and women, along with imposing dress codes and alcohol prohibition. They would also continue Sadiq's policy of Islamization and Arabization of the South, forcibly replacing names in the South with Arabic ones. He was the architect, not the engineer, of the policies and therefore did not fully appreciate the real-world implications of what he was doing. Given his extensive network of informants and NIF loyalists across Sudan, it would be nearly impossible to imagine he did not know what was occurring under his watch. Following the Public Order Act, Hassan al-Turabi would create the Popular Arab Islamic Congress, with the intent of supplanting the Arab League, and invited representatives from terrorist organizations such as Jamaat al-Islamiyah, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah to meet in Khartoum. Turabi was made the chairman of the group, which received funding from both Iran and Osama bin Laden. Turabi would make Sudan a training ground for international Islamist terrorism, with bin Laden and Al-Qaeda relocating there after the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan. Turabi went so far as to marry his niece to bin Laden and to give the bin Laden family's construction company contracts building public infrastructure. But while Turabi was turning Sudan into an Islamist terror state, the civil war raged on. If the SPLA had been hesitant to work with Khartoum after the overthrow of Demairi, this is doubly so for the overthrow of Sadiq, and the military coup failed to reverse the loss in territory by the government. Sudan was already on thin ice with the US when it tilted its foreign policy toward Libya and Iran, but it would absolutely torch itself by being one of the few Arab countries to support Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, which saw the rest of the Arab world withdraw their support from Khartoum. This is why Turabi created the Popular Arab Islamic Congress. It also didn't help their cause when they were the only Arab state on friendly terms with Iran, who had become Sudan's primary arms supplier by 1992. On top of this, Namibia began supporting the SPLA, who would launch an offensive in Juba, Kajo Kaji, and Kaya, and captured all of western Equatoria by November. These battlefield successes would see local militias that had previously been clients of Khartoum begin making peace with the SPLA. Despite this, they had difficulty winning the support of Equatorians who still saw them as a Dinka movement. It also didn't help that the SPLA kept oscillating back and forth between brutal repression and reconciliation with Equatorian civilians. But the fortunes of the SPLA would begin to turn in 1991. The regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam had been dealing with its own civil war since the Derg took power in 1974. Due to Nemairi's support for anti-Derg militias in Ethiopia, Mengistu supported various anti-Khartoum rebels in Sudan, including the SPLA, whose leader in Central Oregon had been operating out of Ethiopia since 1983. But after 17 years of fighting, Mengistu's regime would finally fall in May of 1991, and was replaced with a new government that was more friendly to Sudan. Not only did this cut off the SPLA's biggest supplier of arms, but it would also force the closure of its training camps, forcing the SPLA to relocate over 200,000 people back to southern Sudan. Additionally, the new Ethiopian government handed over all of the files it had kept on the SPLA to al-Bashir, giving him plenty of intelligence to target the SPLA's operations. As South Sudanese refugees began flooding back into Sudan, Khartoum would use incoming international relief aid to split up the SPLA, forcing them to divide their numbers by going to the various camps. However, the US, still angry at Sudan's support for Saddam, threatened to cut off aid and suggested that refugees who couldn't return to their homes be sent back to Ethiopia. But Khartoum would take advantage of the SPLA's dismay, with the Sudanese army launching attacks against their forces in the Upper Nile. Despite the growing international hostility towards the regime in Khartoum, the SPLA's reputation didn't fare much better. Its association with the Mengistu regime, as well as its participation in numerous atrocities in Ethiopia on behalf of it, and its reputation for recruiting child soldiers, made the US want to cut off humanitarian aid not just to Bashir and Tarabi's regime, but to the south as well, and Khartoum would reignite division within the southern camp. The SPLA commanders in Nasir had secretly been in contact with the government for several months, and were trying to get commanders in other theaters to join them in a coup against Garang, likely with the promise of some kind of independence from Khartoum. But after the fall of their primary backer in Ethiopia, most commanders decided it was not the time to disrupt the movement's leadership, so they determined they would go it alone. Going into action on August 28, 1991, their radio address was re-aired on the BBC, declaring the SPLM's new goal was the independence of southern Sudan. The fighting was isolated to the White Nile region, with Garang sending a force led by William Nuwan, but the Nasir forces managed to repulse the advance. Nasir commanders would lose most of their outside support when it was discovered that they were receiving arms from Khartoum. Although the Nasir mutiny failed to overthrow Garang, it did create a big enough opening for al-Bashir to exploit. The Sudanese army began making advances in 1992, regaining territory in Jonglei and eastern Equatoria, and after a failed assault on Juba by Garang's forces, William Nuwan defected to the Nasir faction. As 1992 continued, the Nasir faction began to see more defections. In January 1992, the Nasir leaders met with Khartoum officials and came to an agreement for a referendum on the future constitutional status of the South, albeit with independence off the table. The Nasir faction also agreed to allow the Sudanese army to pass through its territory, which led many local commanders to defect, and return to Garang's faction, headquartered in Torit. Nasir's collaboration with Khartoum angered the Equatorian provinces, believing their actions were counterproductive to southern independence. Having failed to establish credibility amongst pro-independent Southerners, they decided to get whatever support they could by exploiting anti-Dinka sentiment. An informal ceasefire would break out in spring of 1992, when the US-led intervention into Somalia began, with Khartoum fearing they might implement a no-fly zone over Sudan. The campaign only resumed in 1994, with the Sudanese army trying to cut off the SPLA's supply lines from Uganda. Various Ugandan rebel groups had bases in Sudan with Bashir's blessing, so he called on Joseph Kony and his Lord's Resistance Army to attack the SPLA camps and cut off their supply routes from Uganda. The LRA's activities were localized but symptomatic of a larger problem. Many of Africa's borders don't make demographic sense. Drawn by European colonizers, they don't necessarily reflect geographic or ethnic realities. The result is that everyone seems to get involved in everyone else's business. Sudan's radical Islamist government supported the LRA because the LRA harassed Uganda, which backed rebels fighting in southern Sudan. The SPLA would launch a new offensive in 1995, which by the end of 1996 would see most of their gains made by Khartoum since 1992 reversed. The SPLA would form alliances with northern resistance groups as well, which al-Bashir failed to rein in due to most of these militias being Islamist in nature. These battlefield successes followed a shift in international opinion. With Khartoum becoming more internationally isolated due to becoming a state sponsor of terror, al-Bashir felt it necessary to accept any opportunity to end the civil war. Khartoum sought a separate peace with the Nasir faction, hoping it would dilute any demands for greater autonomy from the south. But around this time, efforts were being made to end the infighting between the Nasir and Torit factions. The Nigerian government hosted a series of talks in 1992, which saw the two factions agree on self-determination for the south. A second round of talks broke down in 1993 over religious issues and regional autonomy, while a third meeting in D.C. would result in the Washington Declaration, where they reaffirmed their joint support for self-determination. An economic bloc of African countries, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, began offering mediation in 1994. These meetings drafted the Declaration of Principles, which reaffirmed the right of self-determination, as well as a requirement for the Sudanese government to become democratic and secular before they would agree to cease hostilities with Khartoum. Toward the end of the year, the Umma Party would sign on to the declaration, with the National Democratic Alliance adopting them in 1995. Now, the Sudanese government had rejected these peace demands and had been relying on the support of its neighbors, Ethiopia and Eritrea, But al-Bashir's partner, al-Turabi, had allowed the National Islamic Front to continue supporting Islamist rebels in both countries. And in response to this, Ethiopia and Eritrea, along with Uganda, would begin supporting the SPLA. Khartoum, along with Zimbabwe, would try to keep the Nasir faction on its side by continuing to send funds and arms. But in February 1995, a ceasefire would be declared between the Nasir and Touré factions after the governments of Kenya, Uganda, Eritrea, and Ethiopia agreed to send them arms. In April, the Lafon Declaration was issued, which formally reunited the movement, with a handful of Nasir faction leaders refusing to submit. Khartoum would make separate deals with most of these dissident leaders, and by the late 90s, they began to exploit the disputed oil fields, which led European governments to begin siding with al-Bashir. Turabi's support for international terrorism had already put it on the bad side of the US, and was trying the patience of the Arab world. Domestic Islamists, such as the Ansar militias, began to distrust Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda when rumors spread that they were planning on assassinating Sadiq al-Mahdi. The distrust grew so much that in 1996, the Sudanese government began looking for somewhere to deport bin Laden to, with both Saudi Arabia and Jordan refusing. They also offered to hand him over to the US, but the Clinton administration didn't trust the Sudanese government. So they turned the offer down. This is ultimately why bin Laden would find his way back to Afghanistan, the only country willing to take him in. Bashir would begin a slow process of de-Islamizing the regime, starting by disbanding the popular Arab Islamic Congress. Turabi, playing his own part in trying to repair Sudan's relationship with the rest of the Arab world, would reorganize the NIF as the National Congress Party, and began running for parliament himself in 1997. But this was too little, too late, because the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Tanzania and Kenya were carried out by terrorists using Sudanese passports. The Clinton administration believed that Osama bin Laden was invested in a pharmaceuticals factory in Sudan, which was rumored to be producing chemical weapons that Khartoum was using on the rebels. So on August 20th, President Clinton approved missile strikes on targets in Afghanistan and on the pharmaceutical plant near Khartoum. The attack on the USS Cole on October 12, 2000 was found to have ties to the Sudanese government in 2007 and is believed to have been in retaliation for the 1998 missile strikes. So I'm over 4,000 words into a video about the Second Sudanese Civil War, and I've hardly mentioned Darfur at all, or the conflict, so allow me to backtrack the narrative a couple decades to catch this part of the story up to the late 90s. Droughts throughout much of Africa in the 1970s harmed both farmers and herders in Darfur, with farms competing for shrinking sources of water, and herders competing for a smaller number of grazing sites. This was combined with the introduction of mechanized farming, which displaced many small subsistence farmers, resulting in many being unemployed and crowding into cities in search of work, which exacerbated an overall bad economic climate. Due to the isolated nature of Darfur, Khartoum didn't exercise as much influence or control in the region. Additionally, the civil war in Chad spilled over the border into Darfur, with nomadic Arab militias seeking sanctuary from Hissène Habré's regime. And since Muammar Gaddafi was involved in Chad's civil war, this inevitably meant he was involved in Sudan's as well. Because of this, Ghaffar Namairi would arm the Chadian government against Libya. But after Namairi was overthrown in 1985, the Sudanese government switched sides, supporting Gaddafi and his Arab allies in the borderland between Chad and Sudan, many of which became part of the Popular Defense Forces. When Hissène Habré took power in southern Chad, he began arming the Black Darfurians against the Arabs until he was overthrown in 1990. Some Darfurians would ally with the SPLA, with a former NIF member, Daoud Boulad, leading an SPLA force into the region, but his campaign failed, with Boulad captured and executed in January of 1992. Gaddafi supported two Arab supremacist groups in the region, the Islamic Legion and the Arab Gathering, who sought to ethnically cleanse the Sahel of African farmers and herders. The remnants of these groups were eventually reorganized as the Janjaweed militia in Sudan, with its infamous leader, Sheikh Musu Hilal. The first Darfur rebellion broke out in 1987, pitting the Arabs against the African Fur, when Arab rebels from Chad set up training camps in Darfur, with support from Gaddafi and Sadiq al-Mahdi. The Fur responded by forming the Federal Army of Darfur, or FAD, which trained 6,000 fighters to defend their villages from the hostile Arab militias. But local Arab elites asked Khartoum to help put down the FAD and provided the Janjaweed with weapons more advanced than the Fur could procure for themselves, which resulted in thousands of Fur killed and hundreds of villages looted and burned. A peace agreement from 1989 called for both FAD and the Janjaweed to be disarmed, and for Chadian militias to be deported, but the government in Khartoum never enforced it. On top of this, in 1994, al-Bashir and Turabi would have the province of Darfur split into 3 in order to politically weaken the Fur, just as Namairi had done with southern Sudan back in 1983. The Second Darfur Revolt broke out in 1995 when the Masalit tribe revolted against Khartoum in protest of the newly arrived Arab leaders being granted the titles of Emir, placing them on par with the Masalits' traditional cultural leader, the Sultan. When fighting broke out, Khartoum sided with the Arabs, with the Ansar militias fighting against the Masalit tribe, and the Janjaweed resuming their attacks on the Fur. Another peace agreement was reached in 1999 when al-Bashir agreed to a balance of power agreement between the Masalit and Arabs, after having implemented an Arab-only policy for local councils. At this point, we can now return to the main part of our story. While the fighting was temporarily stopped in Darfur, and the Southerners had put aside most of their differences, we began to see infighting in Khartoum. For a decade, Omar al-Bashir and Hassan al-Turabi had competed for power in the Sudanese government, with Turabi eventually seeking an elected office in parliament. These divisions eventually resulted in the arrest of al-Turabi in 1999. Former ousted Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi had returned from exile, and the U.S. was hostile towards Khartoum over its sponsorship of terrorism and its treatment of the South. By 2001, the final major schism within the SPLA was resolved, which placed Garang in a position to seriously begin negotiations. Both the government and SPLM said they wanted a united Sudan, but both insisted that it was the other's prerogative to make that an appealing offer to the other. But 9/11 would change al-Bashir's calculations, fearing a potential U.S. invasion as happened in Afghanistan and later Iraq, especially with its own direct connections to bin Laden and al-Qaeda and numerous terrorist attacks. This was doubly concerning due to President George W. Bush being very sympathetic to the plight of Christians in Africa. Sudan had been on the president's radar screen since we first arrived in Washington. He wanted to end the decades-long civil war between the South and the North that had resulted in the death of millions of people. Evangelical Christians in the United States had long championed the cause of Christians in the African South of Sudan, who had been oppressed by Arab Muslims in the North. Prior to 9/11 and the War on Terror, Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell had encouraged President Bush to make Africa a focal point of his foreign policy, with Reverend Franklin Graham putting a particular emphasis on South Sudan. In June 2001, the administration would rescind the Clinton-era policy prohibiting emergency aid to northern Sudan. On September 6, 2001, the U.S. appointed former Missouri Senator Jack Danforth as U.S. envoy to Sudan, bringing a list of 4 questions to see how serious al-Bashir was about finally ending the civil war. The message was supposed to be delivered on September 11, 2001, but other events would delay it. In July 2002, Khartoum and the SPLM signed the Machokos Protocol, which set up the broad principles for a peace agreement. Under approval from the president, Colin Powell would entice Bashir to fully commit to peace by offering to remove Sudan from the list of state sponsors of terror. But violence was about to break out in Darfur again. In the year 2000, the Black Book was published. A group calling itself the Justice and Equality Movement analyzed the history of independent Sudan and found 3 tribes, which represented only 5% of the population of Sudan, dominated 70% of senior positions in the government. The movement would begin distributing the book in May 2000 after Friday prayers at mosques across the country. Even Bashir himself received a copy, at which point the regime tried to buy up everyone it could find in order to prevent the dissemination of the information. But in a phenomenon we now call the Streisand effect, these efforts only increased public interest in the book. The Third Darfur Revolt would begin in February 2002. The Fur, Zagawa, and Masalit began attacking army garrisons and looting their armories. Al-Bashir would call on the Janjaweed to put down the revolt, who proceeded to burn down Darfurian villages and massacre civilians. Fur politicians in Khartoum complained to the government about this, after which the local governors were allowed to arrest Arab and Fur militants. But the vice president, Ali Osman Taha, ordered the release of militia leader Sheikh Musa Hilal in April 2003. Khartoum would blame the local governor for the conflict. By October 2003, the rebels had overrun most of Darfur, winning most of their engagements with the Sudanese army. The Darfurian rebels were demanding a seat at the negotiation table between Khartoum and the SPLM, but Bashir feared that allowing them to do so would only encourage more rebellions in the north. And so Khartoum would enact a brutal counterinsurgency. The regime rewarded loyal tribes by giving them lands taken from rebelling tribes, which encouraged the Janjaweed to slaughter and torch more villages. As the army continued losing battles against the Darfurian rebels, they began to shift their focus to attacking civilians as well. The Bush administration would finally secure a ceasefire and a final peace agreement between Khartoum and the SPLM in January 2005, in which both sides agreed to a popular referendum to determine whether the South would remain part of Sudan or become an independent nation. The UN would send 10,000 troops to southern Sudan to ensure the peace, but in order to ensure the cooperation of the Sudanese government, both the UN and the US government had to refrain from referring to the massacres in Darfur as genocide. John Garang would die in a plane crash in June of 2005, many suspecting foul play. And the people of South Sudan would finally get to vote for independence in 2011, becoming the newest country recognized in the UN, and would tragically fall into its own civil war in 2013. But those are all stories for another time. If you have any questions about this video or suggestions for future video topics, then you can leave those down in the comments below. And if you'd like to dig deeper into the subjects of this video, I have my sources listed down there, as well as all of my footnotes. I would also like to thank my newest patrons and channel members for supporting the videos. Phoenix Catfire, Anath Kandala, Kirk Wilson, Kborn Byram, Gary Holtzman, David Olawol, and John Schroeder. Your support allows me to keep making videos even when YouTube and sponsors are uncomfortable with the topics I'm covering. I would also like to thank a viewer named Borna for getting me a couple books off of my Amazon wishlist. These will come in real handy when I finally get around to covering these topics, which I hope to do so. If you're interested in more videos on African history, might I suggest watching this video I made about Uganda last year. Or you could check out my latest video right here. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.